From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're ready for our next session, which is on interviewing techniques. My name is Bob Babcock. I'm president of Americans Remembered, which is one of the partners of the Veterans History Project. As you've probably heard from your time around the Veterans History Project tent, this is a great project, but it's dependent totally upon volunteers. That is the beauty of this project, is that anyone can be a volunteer and anyone can do interviews. And I personally have done about 75 interviews over the last couple of years and have done some classes on them, and one of the things I get from volunteers is, how do I get started? So hopefully today we're going to give you some tips and techniques, and the key point is, don't be afraid, you can do it. Everybody in this audience can do it, and lots of your friends and neighbors and relatives can also do it. On our panel today, we have Todd Moya, who is the director of the Tuskegee Airmen Oral History Project. Todd, raise your hand. And we've got Maggie Rivas Rodriguez, who's the founder of the U.S. Latino and Latina World War II Oral History Project, which was founded in 1999, even before the Veterans History Project was. Maggie? We've got Gary Ray, who is a Vietnam vet and historian at Marathon Music and Video, which does documentary film work. And we've got a very unique one here also, not that all of them aren't unique, but Steve Sabat is professor of psychology at Georgetown University, and he deals extensively with Alzheimer's patients. So he's going to talk about techniques and how you can get stories out of folks on the beginning of Alzheimer's and dementia. So that's our panel, and like Nancy Mitchell told me before we started, now don't scare everybody away because you've got all these professional interviewers up here, because at one time we all started fresh, and we need more and more of you, because you see how many people we have walking around today that couldn't make it today, and you've heard the story that we're losing 1,700 veterans each and every day. So time is of the essence to preserve these stories. So let's talk about, for opening this thing up, the pre-interview steps, because you don't walk up to somebody cold and say, I want to do an interview with you. You need to do some pre-interview stuff. Would one of you here in the group like to talk about how do we set this up to get somebody lined up and be ready for them? Gary?
Well, I do walk up to them cold sometimes. You know, you go to a donut shop or a coffee shop, and there are these guys with these hats on that say World War II vet or USS whatever, and you can strike up a conversation and say, tell me about your experiences, and they talk to you for a little while, and then you just explain the program. Well, they've established this Veterans History Program in the Library of Congress, and they're looking for just people's remembrances and the things that they can recall. And would you like to do an interview with us so that we can send that to the Library of Congress, and we'd love to give you a copy also. And so that's a way to approach it. And often finding people is the hardest step in this interview process. Word of mouth is a good way. Asking people you interview, do you have friends that you think would like to participate in this program? Would you mind talking to them about this experience, giving them our phone number so that we can come do interviews with them?
Absolutely right. Finding the vet is the key part. Steve, you got any comments on how we get started with this?
Well, one thing that I should point out to you.
Closer.
I have to confess, I am not a professional interviewer, but I'm a practicing human being. And one of the things that I do is, in working with people who have Alzheimer's disease, is to try to figure out the abilities that people have that still remain intact despite the fact that they have losses in some aspects of memory and organization of movement and the like. And what happens usually is that I'll hang out at adult day centers or families will call me, or the Alzheimer's Association will send people my way, because I can help families kind of navigate things better to make things work. And in the process of doing that, I get to know people. And I like to try to find common ground. And one of the best ways of interviewing people, get them to open up to you, is to have some common ground. And that common ground can be your own vulnerability, things that you can't do and you kind of feel embarrassed about, or it can be common ground about things you know. And one of the things I know a lot about, in some respects, is World War II, because my dad's a World War II vet, and I grew up with those stories. And so one of the things that really helpful is to find that common ground and ask a question. Hey, were you in the service during World War II? I mean, sometimes it opens up people very, very, very clearly, because those kinds of things bring back memories that are rooted in a person's sense of self-worth and pride. So when you touch on things that a person feels good about, it really opens up a conversation. I could talk more about that if you like, but I don't want to dominate.
We'll get back to that in a second. Todd, tell us how you get started.
Well, we do as much background research as possible, but I think you can overdo that. It's important to, in the case of World War II veterans, to, as much as possible, know which squadron fits in with which group and where they served, and have a general idea of campaigns and things like that, so that you don't ask the really stupid questions. We say that there are no stupid questions, but of course there are some stupid questions, and you can embarrass yourself and cut the conversation off pretty quickly if you ask either the stupid question or the right question the wrong way. So we try to get the background information down, but I try to go into an interview with as few preconceived notions as possible, as few ideas about where I want the interview to head, because I really want to catch the spontaneity of the conversation. And especially with new interviewers, I would encourage that approach, because it's really easy to psych yourself out of it, to make yourself think that you don't know enough to go out and do that first interview. There's a fine line between doing the necessary background information and convincing yourself that you have to know everything before you go in and do the interview. Of course, you'll never know everything. So try to find that balance. Try to do that background information, but don't psych yourself out of it.
Very good point. Maggie, let's hear your thoughts.
When we started, we talked to the Shoah Foundation. They've been doing oral history interviews, and I forget, they have something like 30,000 interviews or something amazing. They have something called a pre-interview form, which is very extensive. And of course, they're dealing with people that were in concentration camps during World War II. But I looked at it and I said, what a great way to figure out what these people are going to, what their experience is, and to be able to know some of the kind of the hard questions, the detailed questions that you may not want to ask them on tape. So we asked for permission to adapt this to our uses. So we adapted it, and now we start out, our first meeting is usually a pre-interview where we go over this really long form. It's on our website. Feel free to use it and take a look at it. Some of the questions, we'd ask people, just to be as comfortable as they can. If they're not comfortable answering certain questions, they don't have to. But it really does help us as we're getting ready for our preparation for the interview. Good,
thank you. Because I think what they've said along here is finding the veteran, making them comfortable, getting yourself prepared so that you know enough to have a meaningful conversation, doing your work beforehand, and the pre-interview form as a possibility. But I think what they've also said is there's no one way to do it. Do it however, but I think Todd said it very well. Don't psych yourself out and never get around to it. My first interview I did with a colonel who was a friend of mine. And I made mistakes, but it was a good interview. And I realized how good an interview it was when I met with his son and 2 daughters the night before his funeral and gave them each a copy of the tape that they didn't even know existed, and they watched it that night, and they said, you know what, my dad never told me those stories. Now they have those things preserved even though he's gone, so don't put off getting started. Okay, we know how to get started. Now when we get into an interview, who wants to talk about how to do an interview? Todd, start off. Or Maggie,
How
start
to do an interview. Okay, that's a very broad question, and that's one thing that you might do is throw out a broad question. Tell me a little bit about growing up in California. Tell me a little bit about school. What we try to do is start off with a question that they feel like they're the expert at. You want to empower them. You want them to feel like they're in their own territory. We're not asking them to be historians because that's not their business. What they're the expert on, what they're the authority on, is their own lives. And so to the extent that you tell them, you know, everything that you can tell us about your experience, that's what we're here for, and that's why your information is so valuable to us. So, you know, if you can start out with a pretty broad question and ask them the stuff, and it could be something like, oh yeah, let me make sure I understand. You were born in XX place and at XX time. And then from there, because they're warming up too, as you're warming up, they're warming up to the interview too, so a little softball there.
Just to underline a couple of things that Maggie said, you're trying to create an atmosphere that's as comfortable as possible for the veteran. 9 times out of 10, the best place to do the interview is in that person's home, in a room where they're most comfortable. Again, 9 times out of 10, you're going to have much more success if you start with those general questions and work toward the more specific. In general, you really want to create the kind of atmosphere where you're setting the person up as a teacher, and you're a student, and you're sending whatever signals, be they verbal or nonverbal, that what this person has to tell you is important, and you're very much engrossed in it, and you can't wait to hear what they have to tell you. Specific questions are really not the issue. There's no right way and no wrong way to come up with a list of specific questions, but I'd encourage you, especially as you get more comfortable with it, not even to have a specific list of questions that you're going to ask every veteran. It's real easy to tell who the uncomfortable interviewers are because they have a questionnaire that they're determined to get through. And as soon as the veteran answers question number 1, maybe he's not even finished answering question number 1, they can't wait to get to question number 2. So as tempting as it is to go in there with a questionnaire, try to resist that temptation, and be comfortable with silence. Give the person a chance to come up with the words that they want to come up with, and don't feel like you have to jump up and get in there and interrupt the conversation to keep the tape rolling. Tape's cheap.
Let me throw in another one, and don't be afraid to turn the tape off if somebody gets emotional and starts crying. I mean, I had a fellow who was in on the liberation of the Dachau prisoner camp, and he was just as vivid as it was the day he did it. And he started crying, so we stopped, let him get his composure back, and continued to march.
Well, I can really kind of reiterate a number of things that you've heard already, but I think it's important to focus again on the whole issue of a person who has Alzheimer's disease, and what I'm interested in usually is not necessarily a person being a veteran of World War II, but I'm interested in the person's subjective experience of what it's like to have that disease. And that, in a sense, puts the person in the situation of being the expert. I mean, I don't know what it's like to have that disease, and I'm depending upon the person who has it to give me to understand what it's like. And when you put a person who has, especially a person who has Alzheimer's disease, in the driver's seat, in the position of having some kind of expertise, it changes the dynamic of the relationship completely. Because you know, how many times, I mean, I don't know if anybody here have a relative who has Alzheimer's or know people who have, okay, so there are people, so I mean, how many times does a person who has Alzheimer's disease have a situation where somebody says to him or her, could you help me with something? That person is usually being helped by others. And now the situation is, I need your help. And that changes the whole social dynamic of a person. I mean, and usually the people who are of that age are people who are givers anyway. I mean, they've been givers all their lives. And what happens is what Todd just said about giving people time. A person who has Alzheimer's disease sometimes has word-finding problems. Literally can't find the words that he or she wants to use. And knows what the ideas are, but can't quite find the words. And sometimes you just have to sit there and be silent, because if you interrupt, you could break the train of thought. And so you really have to be comfortable with that silence, and it's okay. I've had people sit with me 40 seconds of silence as a person's trying to find now you sit there, you do it yourself sometime. I mean, I'm not going to do it here because we don't have that, but I mean, you could do it yourself. 40 seconds of silence. It could be interminable. It could feel that way, but what you're doing is you're presenting a person with a certain relaxed kind of a sense too, that there's no hurry, and what you have to say is important. And I'm not going to interrupt you. And if you and I might even ask for your help. I mean, if a person says something that I don't understand, especially if a person has Alzheimer's disease, if I don't understand it, I'm certainly not going to say, oh, okay, because I don't understand. I'm going to say, listen, I'm having some trouble understanding what you're saying. And if I have an idea about what the person's trying to say, I might say, well, let me see if I understand what you're trying to tell me. Are you trying to say that such a... And now the person can say yes or no. And it creates a different kind of relationship. And in the process of doing that, you can get to things like, what about your life? I need to know about your life. Somebody once said to me, why you ask me questions about when I was in college and when I was a teenager? It's because I need to know who I'm talking to. I mean, I have to have an idea who you are. If you need my help with something, I need to understand who you are and how to work with you. So who you are is who you've been in some ways. And that goes in, that involves experiences in the war and thereafter and before. So, I mean, we can come back to this stuff if you have questions, but it really is about being person with a person and giving that person to understand that there's something that he or she has something valuable to offer and to give.
This is a tough group to follow. As you can see, I take a pretty casual approach to this because I want the veteran to feel very comfortable, and I want him to feel like he's just relating these to me as a person, not necessarily for the record. And I think it's important to point out that the program isn't just for World War II veterans, it's for veterans of any conflict or people who supported veterans of any conflict. So I've done almost 1,500 of these, and they're none of them the same. And nor have I asked the same questions in them, because you should operate on what the veteran wants to talk about and ask questions that feed off of what he's already told you and carry them through this experience. It's important for them to know, and I tell them up front, this is just about what you remember, about what you saw, felt, smelled, heard. I don't care about dates. I don't care about place names. I care about what you remember, about what happened to you. And that's what we can get from you that we can't get from the books. And so that's an important concept, I think. Make them comfortable. The Library of Congress's biographical form that we have to fill out, it's a good way to get them talking about them. They know where they were born, they know when they were born, and those are some of these questions. And so that's a good intro, if you will, to get them going. And I can't emphasize again what has already been said. Be ready to be quiet. The way I like to tell the veterans is everybody's heard me speak more than they want to. They would rather hear you talk. And so I kind of put the burden on them to carry that torch.
Thank you. I think we got some real good tips here. And as I heard, what I've heard was make the veteran comfortable. They're in the driver's seat. It's their life story. There's no wrong answer. Whatever they experienced in life, that's the way it ought to be. And silence is not bad. Sitting and letting them think is okay. So, Todd, you focus on a specific organization, and so do you, Maggie, right? You work on the Spanish and you on the Tuskegee Airmen, whereas Gary and Stephen and I work across the board. I think as you do interviews and you start getting serious about doing interviews, you may decide only to do your father, your grandfather, and that's all you ever want to do, and that's fine. But if you want to get serious on it, you might decide to focus on something that's of interest to you. Gary Swanson in Kansas City is a volunteer that works with me who focuses exclusively on World War II veterans. And he's done 350 interviews in the last year and a half. And I do it across the board. I like World War II, Vietnam, Korea, Somalia, Iraq, you name it, I'll do it. So anybody you want to interview, plus home front workers, are fascinating people to talk to. One of the best interviews I ever did was with a lady telling me about how you pack a POW package to go through the International Red Cross. It was a fascinating interview. So let's talk about some of the specifics that you go after and how you got, you know, we can just keep this going up and down here until we run out of time, because all of you got some great experiences and things to talk about. Steve, you got the mic. Say something.
Something. There are some situations that I've come upon with people who just happen to be either veterans or had some kind of job during the war here in Washington, D.C. And sometimes with people with Alzheimer's, you know, there are word-finding problems. And there was this one man who I've spent some time with, a couple of days a week for maybe 6, 7 months. And I asked him, well, what, you know, were you in the war? He seemed to be of the proper age and such, and he said, oh, yeah. And I said, well, what did you do? And he said, oh, I was the top guy. I was the top guy. And I mean, I don't know what he means by the top guy. And I said, were you a general? And he said, no. And I said, well, were you a colonel or something? What were you? And he really couldn't find the right words and so on. And what I had to do was some detective work. Now, you know, here's the deal. I want to make a point about this, because when a person has Alzheimer's disease, very often when a person says something that doesn't make sense to us, or the guy says, I'm the top guy, well, maybe this guy's delusional because he's got Alzheimer's disease. He's making up some story. Well, I had to do some detective work, and so I spoke with his wife. And I asked his wife, well, what was he up to during World War II? And she told me that he was the pilot of a bomber, an aircraft. He was the top guy in that plane. I mean, he had a crew beneath him, you know. I mean, and so, no, he was not, but I was giving him the benefit of the doubt from the get-go. Now, when he said he was the top guy, I was believing it. Now, my problem was figuring out what he meant. And when I did that, and I connected with him, now we had a relationship going, and he would tell other people. He could never remember my name. He couldn't recall my name. But when he always saw me, whenever he saw me, he would always say, you know, good friend. He called me good friend, and God bless you, you know. And he would say to some students, oh, he's trying to get in, you know, and he'd point to his head. He's trying to get in, and, you know, and it's tough for me. But I would be able to ask him and talk to him about things like that, and he understood my intentions. And by virtue of that, he felt a whole lot better about his day-to-day, because he was being looked at not as a person who has brain damage, but as a person who has something to give. And that's one of the most incredible things about the culture that we live in, is that you know, people get older, and people are, I mean, it's the Pepsi generation, or you're supposed to take Botox injections and make yourself look younger, and everybody's got to mean looking like they just came out of the womb before long. But the problem is that when we think of people who are elderly as not having anything to give, we create a self-fulfilling prophecy. And when a person has Alzheimer's, that's pretty embarrassing. If I was sitting here and I couldn't find the words that I wanted to use to talk to you, I'd be really, really embarrassed. And I'd probably shut up and go hide, and maybe I would cry. And if you saw me crying somewhere over there and you came over to me and said, why are you crying? I might say, well, I don't know. Because I couldn't find the words to tell you just what had happened a few moments ago. So when we talk to people who have Alzheimer's and about their experiences, it really creates a different situation for them. And you do you play detective. Every time a person who I've talked to with that disease has said something, there's always a decent thread to find. And that's my experience, at least. So it's a two-way deal. And your own humanity comes out in droves when you're dealing with people like that.
Excellent. Todd, give us some more thoughts.
Oh, boy. Well, just to pick up on Steve's point, the most fulfilling thing about oral history for me is the human interaction, just the humanness of the experience, sitting down and talking to someone. I always feel so grateful that people have let me into their lives to the degree that they have, and have told me the stories that they tell me. I feel like I'm not worthy to be sitting there sometimes hearing this person open up to me. But the humanness of that exchange is what's really so fulfilling about it. As Bob mentioned, I'm the director of the Tuskegee Airmen Oral History Project, which is a project of the National Park Service in conjunction for a National Historic Site that we're developing in Tuskegee, Alabama, the site of flight training for America's first black military pilots. And you know, I came to this as a civil rights historian rather than a military historian. And if I had any assumptions about the interviews that I wanted to do, they, at the beginning at least, would have all focused on the civil rights aspect of this story, the discrimination that people faced, the strategies they came up with for overcoming that discrimination, things like that. But I learned really quickly that that's not what everyone wants to talk about. And some people do want to talk about strictly military strategies and campaigns and things like that and how they fit into them. They want to talk strictly about the airplanes and the mechanical characteristics of a P-39 versus a P-51, where to me there is no difference whatsoever. An airplane's an airplane. But I had to learn quickly that what I thought about that didn't matter. And I've always had the attitude that my job is just to help someone tell their story. It's to facilitate, to moderate, to help someone tell the story they want to tell. And if they don't necessarily know what they want to tell, then I really do have to get in there and sort of prod them along. I don't know if I'm answering the original question or not, but I hope those are some good pieces of advice for people who haven't done this before. As Bob said at the beginning, we were all beginners once. I've been doing this about 10 years, but I've made every mistake you can possibly make, asking the stupid questions and screwing up the release forms and everything else. One thing I did want to mention is that the project packet that the Veterans History Project has come up with is the most useful I've ever seen in the 10 years that I've been doing oral history. The practical advice that's in there for people who are beginning to do this, even for people who've been doing it for 10 years, I still find practical pieces of advice that help me do better oral history interviews. The release forms and everything that goes with it. Please do take advantage of all of the project materials that are there for your use, just for the asking.
Great. Maggie, let's talk some more.
My project is the U.S. Latino and Latina World War II Oral History Project. It's not strictly a military project. It really looks at the social history of what was going on with Latinos and Latinas of the World War II generation. And we've had a lot of interviewers done. One thing that really has helped us is I also teach a class where my students have been working on the project. And one thing that's really helped them is to watch some interviews that have already been done, because they start to get real critical of the other interviewers, and they say, wow, why did they ask that question? Why didn't they ask that question? When they find themselves in the middle of the interview, then they understand about a little bit more about two things. One is the follow-up question and the detail question. The best oral history interviews that I've seen have been those oral history interviews that incorporate a lot of detail in them. Because my idea of a party is very different from my parents' idea of a party, and my children's, for sure, idea of a party. In my parents' generation, a party was probably in someone's house, and they might have had 3 musicians doing live music. They may have had a big bucket of ice with some soft drinks in it. For us to make that history come alive for future generations, we want to get those details as much as possible. So for what we try to do in interviews is we try to get as much of those details and say, if someone says they met this woman at a party, tell me about that party. What was it? What kind of music were they playing? What kind of dress was she wearing? What were you wearing? That's the kind of stuff that means something very different for that generation of people than it does later on. The other thing that it's really hard, but after an interview, most of our interviews are around 2 hours, I generally find myself exhausted because it takes a lot of energy to concentrate and to listen very, very hard to what people are saying. If you are lucky and you're doing the interview, you'll find that they'll start wanting to give you suggestions of what they want to talk about. Sometimes they'll be bold about it and they'll say, I need to talk about this. Usually they don't, though, and they'll kind of mention something. We had one student do an interview the man kept on saying, and of course both my parents died when I was 7 years old. And the student had a list of questions. We do have guideline questions. Student had a list. Okay, that's too bad. Next question. So where were you during World War II? Well, I was stationed overseas, and it was really hard because, of course, my parents died when I was 7 years old. Next question. Went on. This happened like 4 times. This poor man obviously wanted to talk about the death of his parents. It was something that was very traumatic to him. So if you're, that's a kind of listening that, you know, if you're listening to what he's saying, you'll start hearing this, and that will make a much, much better interview.
Well, I agree with it. There's some great points here, and we're going to throw it open to questions here in just a minute. But one of the things that I think you need to think about when you do an interview is, why are you doing this, and why does the person want to be interviewed? And why the reason I do it is for the person and his family. It's not for the Veterans History Project. The Veterans History Project is a secondary beneficiary, but the primary reason for the interview is to get that story of that family member or that veteran, whoever it is, preserved for themselves and their families. So keep that in mind, and you realize you're doing a great service for these veterans and these home front workers when you interview them and get a copy of the tape back to them.
I just want to say one thing. I'm not quite so selfless as that. I do think it's important for our families to get these interviews, but for our project is because our main goal is we want to make sure that Latinos aren't left out of the history books as they are today. And so when we're doing our interviews, we're very much looking at getting that historical record. So it's really great that the family, and it's really wonderful, and believe me, they do get the copy of the tapes. A lot of the people that have been interviewed, they use a copy of their tapes at memorial services, unfortunately, because a lot of our members people have passed on. But really the big goal is that we want to make sure that we have some kind of documentation.
Outstanding. Okay, let's throw it open, and if you don't have questions, we'll continue to talk till we run you off, I think, or run out of time. But let's see what questions you have, and maybe we can answer it up here. I need a helper that can come around here with a microphone. There we go. There she is.
Hi, you had mentioned that there's a pre-interview form that you use. Ms. Reyes, you can't hear it? You had mentioned there is a pre-interview form that you use in your own interviews. You said that's available on your website. Can you provide that website address?
You know, I brought a whole bunch of our newspapers. We do a newspaper, and they're all gone. I thought we were going to have enough. The website for the Veterans History Project? Oh, for my project? For our project. Okay, if you do this, just go to Google and look it up on Google. It's http www.utexas.edu/projects with an S/Latino Archives. One word, yeah.
And the Veterans History Project also has a very useful pre-interview, I forget what they call it, data sheet or data form, something like that.
Okay, another question.
Maggie, if I may address you as Maggie. Most of our World War II veterans, Latino veterans, speak Spanish and are bilingual. I know that when we interview and try to get their stories, most of their stories end up being related to us in Spanish. And I think it's wonderful. But sometimes a lot is lost in the translation. Can you say something to that?
Translation Spanish to English, it's an issue, it's a challenge. We do interviews in Spanish and we do interviews in English, and it gets very complicated. And if you give me your business card and your address, we'll send you our final issue of the newspaper. Anybody who wants to get our final issue of the newspaper, please give me your business card and your contact information. What we have to do is we listen to the interview. If we're lucky, we have someone write it in Spanish and then translate it into English. And then we have to have somebody else go back and make sure that it meshes. And it's not easy, and you really need kind of a couple of people. We have native-born Spanish speakers who are students who work for us, And then it's either my mother and my sister in San Antonio who look over it. So we kind of draft a lot of people, but it's a challenge.
Thank you.
Stephen, how would you deal with the matter of informed consent with Alzheimer's?
Matters of informed consent?
Yeah.
Well, what I usually do is contact, I mean, when I meet somebody, it could be in one of three ways. One way is that the person is referred to me through the Alzheimer's Association, or the Alzheimer's Association will talk to a caregiver, and I'll make a connection that way. But I usually will ask both the caregiver and the person with the disease if they mind if I chat with them about all sorts of things in their lives. And in fact, it's kind of interesting about that, because there have been times when I've asked the caregiver if it's okay, and I'm not going to intrude on anybody's life, but sometimes a question can be felt as if it's intruding. I mean, people have different senses of privacy. And so one man I asked, well, I mean, I'd like to know more about your life. And he said, well, I'm going to have to talk with my wife about this. And I had already talked with her about it, but he didn't know that. But in any event, I mean, I will be very open about this. And usually what I'm trying to give is some sort of help in facilitating a relationship and using the abilities that are still there. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm really very open about this. And in fact, one family said to the wife of one of the people I spent about 9 months with said to me, "You know more about our family than anybody who isn't in our family." And usually what happens is that it becomes very human. It's not a matter of, it's kind of like what you've been hearing here. It's not a matter of a cold, calculated kind of, oh, give me information, now I got it, I can go run with it. It's really more about being human beings in the first place, and that opens up a lot of business for you. If you want more information about this, there are lots of places to get it, and one place is a website. The URL is memorybridge.org, which kind of makes sense, right? But I mean, I have forms that I'll give people, and then just sort of saying that this is what I'm trying to do, and this is what the purpose of this whole exercise is. But sometimes they're coming to me because I want you to help my wife with her word finding problems. So does that help some?
Any other questions?
Okay, thank you. Mr. Sabat, sometimes when I'm interviewing my father, he's a World War II veteran.
I didn't catch the first part of that.
Sometimes when I'm interviewing my father, he's a World War II veteran. We might be talking about a specific campaign or battle, and he'll, after about 10 or 15 minutes, he'll take a pause, and he'll just not come back as if he'd forgotten everything we were talking about. He'll go on to something else related, totally different. How do you get back to the ending of the first story?
Okay, let me see if I understand what you asked me. You said, okay, the person starts, a veteran starts talking about situation X, and then comes to some kind of a stop, and there's a gap in time, and then picks up with something else. And how do I get back to the first thing? Well, sometimes I don't go back to the. It really kind of depends on the situation. I mean, I'm not really driving the train here, so I mean, the person may stop talking about story A and pick up with story B, and then we'll take story B wherever it goes. And I may find, I mean, as this is it's sort of like the long and winding road. But I mean, as Todd was saying, more of a facilitator than anything else. And so there may be a situation where a word or an episode or there's some theme that is in story B that was kind of like what was in story A. And if that happens, and I'm really interested in finding out about story A, I might say, hey, that sounds a lot like what you were saying about such and such. I mean, does that make any sense? I mean, is that the kind of thing that when you were, and I'll play it back, when you were doing this and this and this over there, Did that sort of thing happen at that time too? I'm really animated. I'm curious. Does that make some sense? So I'm not going to stop the person from going on with story B because I want to get back to the other thing.
Okay, unless we've got some real strong interest in another question, we will start wrapping it up. And I think our last question, I want to start with Gary down here on the panel, is let's run it down because as you all know, the Veterans History Project is dependent upon volunteers. And all of us are volunteers and as are hundreds and thousands of others. And I think it would be worthwhile if you're thinking about this let's go down through the panel and say, why do you do this, Gary? What satisfaction do you personally get out of doing this?
I may be the wrong guy to start this with. I'm a professional historian. I work for a documentary film company. We've been doing this for 7 years. So it's my job, but I'm also a retired Army officer. And this is the most rewarding thing that I've done since I retired from the service. I love these guys. I love to go out and do this and hear these stories and make that human connection and become their friend. I've forged some lifetime friendships in this project, and these stories are so important, not only for the families to hear, but for the national record. It's just essential that we understand the Latino and the Black and the American Indian and the other contributions to our history and the personal cost to people who've been engaged in these conflicts. America needs to understand what it costs to go to war, and this is one way to do that. That's why I do it.
Good. Steve?
Well, I like challenges. I mean, when people say something can't be done, my reaction as a guy who grew up in New York City is, oh yeah? I mean, usually people who have Alzheimer's disease are marginalized, and so when we think about people who are in the Latino community, the Black community, I mean, whatever community it is, these are people who might be classified as sort of being others, and people who have brain damage have taken on that same quality. And I like to find the human being in there, and that's the person who's still there and just needs some help to get out. And so the joy in this for me is to say, to make a new friend and actually do something that helps somebody feel good and make a day, a minute, an hour better for a person, a family, a friend. I mean, it's all about being a human being, and if you can't be that with one another, then what the hell are we doing here in the first place?
Amen. Todd?
All of what these guys have said, plus a determination that the historical record has to reflect the diversity of this country and the people who've served it. In my case, preserving stories of Tuskegee Airmen for a National Historic Site, and more generally for the historical record. 15, 20 years ago, before the HBO movie came out, nobody had heard of the Tuskegee Airmen, and that has changed a lot in the years since. But just a determination that people 20 or 30 years from now who won't have a chance to meet people who were a part of this experience will be able to get to know them through our interviews. So I do it for the future historian, let's say, and try to anticipate what that person wants to know about these people, and do interviews that will be useful to that future historian.
Okay, Maggie?
I'm really giving back. These people that we interview for the Latino and Latina World War II Oral History Project didn't have the opportunities that we have today. Mexican Americans in particular face segregated schools. A lot of them didn't have a school after 4th grade, so the highest they could go to school in a lot of places was 4th grade. In my generation, because of the efforts that those people made, we had desegregated schools, we had grants, and we had scholarships. I was able to go to college, but it was because of those people that put their tails on the line for us so that they could knock down those doors. So the only reason that I've gotten what I've gotten has been because of what those people went through and the sacrifices they made. So I'm just doing something that I can do that they weren't able to do 60 years ago.
Okay, thank you. And I tell you why I do it, and I don't have any particular group that I focus on. I just do anybody and everybody, but so I'm not focused on any smaller group. But like they've others said, I've made some great friends. I take a B-17 pilot who calls me regularly, and we go out to lunch together, and I never met him before I interviewed him. I've got a P-51 pilot who I interviewed up here on D-Day. I've got the lady who typed the orders for the D-Day invasion for General Eisenhower is up here running around somewhere now, up here having a great time. I have made great friends, and I've learned so much, and it is so valuable. And one thing that I believe, people thank you for caring about their lives. And that's what makes it so good. And I've also found that often they like to talk to a non-family member because they can be more honest with a non-family member than somebody who knows all the warts and the truths in their life. So think about that. Get outside your family to interview. But you get going on this thing, and then once you get finished with an interview, take some time to sit down with your favorite beverage and pop it into the TV set and look at it and see how it went, so that the next interview you do, you can improve on it. Think about the mistakes you made, such as, was the camera looking into a window and I've got a glare behind them? You don't want to do that. You do that one time, you never do it again. Was the microphone close enough so that I could hear them? Was that clock ticking that my human mind cut out and I didn't hear it, but the camera hears it, and that tick tock, you see I've made all these mistakes. So it's taking the time to sit down with your favorite beverage, and don't drink too much of that beverage if it's an alcoholic beverage before you get into this thing, but it's learn about it, and then go back and do another one and another one. And after you've done 4 or 5 interviews, it starts being much more fun. Maggie's got something.
One thing, really helpful, wear a set of earphones, wear a set of headphones into the interview so that you can pick up, you can listen to what the camera or the tape recorder is picking up, because otherwise you think that the audio is great, and you get back, and I've heard this before, you can hear the birds chirping, the guy's mouth is moving, the birds are chirping, and you can't get anything. So make sure that you have a set of headphones. Doesn't have to be expensive, but just so you can hear with the camera, the tape recorders. If you have an external microphone, that's the ideal is to have an external microphone, either a clip-on mic or a table mic like this. But the main thing is that if you don't have, because some of the video cameras, if you buy a video camera to do this, make sure to look that there's a little place that you can stick an external microphone in the video camera. Because a lot of the video cameras these days are great. You can get a good one for $300, but there's no jack for you to stick in an external microphone. Most of them do have a little place to stick in the headphones, but look for that because it'll say MIC, and it'll have a little earphone thing that's for the headphones. If you just spend another $100 just for those 2 features, it will save you so much grief. I can't even tell you. You'll be so happy.
And one other thing as we wrap up here, the Veterans History Project has all kinds of literature laying around the tent here. Pick that up. Go to their website. There you go, yeah, and go to their website and look up things. And another website that you can look up things on where there are some interesting tips is one that we've put up for Americans Remembered, because I've developed, based upon my experience and that of the folks working with me, some helpful tents. You're welcome to that. Just ask me for it and I'll send it to you. It's that's www.americansremembered.org. And once again, that's one guy's approach. And this is a critically important project we're on, and everybody's story is important to be preserved. It's not just World War II, as we said. It's World War II, World War I, if you find any, all the way up to these folks coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan right now. It's those who supported them. So go out, have fun, interview. If you have questions, contact the Veterans History Project. They'll be glad to help you. Any of us would be glad to help you. And we appreciate your patience and attention. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.